Yeah, so loans are definitely more and more common since the amount's gone up to 800K. People use it to patch it. Now, loans from, for example, banks like home equity line of credit or asset collateralized loans are easy because then you just have to show the source of funds for the underlying asset. How did you acquire that house and how you're borrowing against it? However, a loan from a personal entity, person, company becomes a little bit more complicated. First thing is, I get a question of, can it be a 0% loan at 30 years? No, it can't. It needs to be at market terms, right? Follow the AFR, make it a 7-year loan. You can make it an interest-only loan. You can have the whole amortization schedule laid out in your loan agreement, which is prepared by your attorney. And at the end of the 7-year, you can have a bubble payment, but it needs to be market terms. Second question I get asked is, well, can I just make it a gift from a friend or a company? You can't, the government's not going to believe that a friend or a company is gifting you money. If you're borrowing money from a company or a friend, you always need to show that other person's source of funds. A lot of times when I step in from another attorney's file, I notice that the attorney has not educated the investor nor the lender about what documents can be asked. So a lot of the times I'll go back to the lender and say, hey, can you provide these documents? And there is hesitation or skepticism. The client will come back and say, hey, well, no one told me I was supposed to provide this and I don't feel comfortable providing that. If that person, the lender, does not provide the document, the case is closed. There's nothing you can do. You have to respond with their documentation, which is why it's very important to have this conversation in advance with the lender to make sure that they're comfortable providing those documents. And the second thing is your attorney can always create a Chinese wall whereby you don't get to see the lender's documents. The attorney is just doing the source of funds on the other side and submitting that to USCIS. So they can create a Chinese wall to make the lender more comfortable. And the third point is, if you're paying interest, which you will be to the lender absolutely needs to disclose that as income, because the government can come back and ask for tax returns that indicate that this tax or interest income has been accounted for. Collateral is, I get the question of, can there be an unsecured loan? Yes, after Zhang, there can be an unsecured loan. However, again, the loan needs to be at market terms. If there's a collateral in place, you need to make sure that you account for how that collateral was acquired. Another question I get asked is, can I deduct the interest rate that I pay on my loan? The answer is no. You cannot deduct because it's a personal loan. Any interest that you pay on it is not deductible. And any foreign documents, again, for USCIS is very, very strict. Any foreign documents need to be submitted with English document on top and the foreign document at the bottom. A lot of the times, loan documents, promissory notes, collateral documents will be in foreign languages. It's extremely important to submit translated documents along with the local language documents for the government to look at. I've had cases where there's a lot of overlap between English and Gujarati or English and Hindi, and the client's like, well, there's only these 6 words that are not translated. You'd be surprised at the RFE you'd get just for those 6 words. So you want to make sure every document is translated.
Tell us what is RFE and why does that matter, and why do you want to really avoid that if possible?
Yeah, so RFE is a request for evidence, which means that the government is not convinced that the story you're telling is true, or they think there are gaps in your story. They're not happy with your explanation. I absolutely loathe RFEs, which is why I put a lot of work in up front. And the reason to loathe is, it's one, you have very limited time. You have 88 days to respond. A lot of the times it's not even possible for the clients to get documents within that time period. Second, once you get an RFE and you respond to that RFE, there's no time limit within which the government needs to get back to you. I have files from 7 other attorneys that are in RFE stage that I responded to that have been pending for 18 months. So you really, really want to avoid that RFE. And the reason that's important for Indian nationals is that RFE can cause retrogression. So 18 months ago, if India hadn't retrogressed, now 18 months from then, India is retrogressed, which means even if you're getting an approval, you're not going to see that green card until your date becomes current. Causes a lot of stress for the attorney, causes a lot of stress for the client. I much rather do all the heavy lifting up front than receive an RFE. Sometimes the RFE is 15, 20 pages long. Sometimes it's 1 page. I've seen RFEs where I've submitted gift affidavits and the government has come back and said, hey, where's the gift affidavit? And then it's just a matter of resubmitting if your attorney has retained a copy of the file. You really want to try your hardest to avoid an RFE. Off late, what we've seen is we've seen the government jumping straight to a notice of intent to deny. For example, if you get an RFE, you respond and the government's not happy. They can come back and send a notice of intent to deny and say, hey, we're not really happy with your answer. You need to provide A, B, and C more. They only give you 33 days to respond to that. If the government skips the RFE stage and sends you a notice of intent to deny and gives you 20 pages to address in 33 days, you better hope your attorney has time to respond to that. And you have the time to run around and get the documents for that as well. So you want to try your hardest to avoid an RFE or notice of intent to deny, which also ties into the reputation of a regional center and a reputation of a project. A lot of the times, even if they have questions about just the project, they'll lump in the source of funds questions and they'll just give you 33 days to respond. Which is why it's extremely important to go with a reputable regional center, a reputable project that has a full set of documents, that has filed a 956F, and eventually, maybe over 2 to 3 years, we'll know what all projects have been approved. But until all the projects exemplar are approved, what you can do is look at the track record, right? So if it's EB5AN, you go back and say, hey, have you had any project-related denials? That saves you from the grief of having to deal with RFEs or notice of intent to deny.
Tell us a little bit about cases where, you know, other attorneys mess something up and you got the call to come in and step in. How many of those cases have you taken on, you know, over the last 10 years? And, you know, were you able to save most of them, all of them? And, you know, what are some of the main kind of problems that you uncovered?
Yeah, so I say I do an average of 3 to 4 cleanup work per month. And I say I have been able to rescue about 98% of them. I usually know in advance what I can't rescue. And it's obvious because when I start taking on the client, I first interview the client. There are 2 situations in which I can't rescue a file. If you've borrowed funds from someone and that person refuses to give their source of funds document, there's nothing I can do to save the file. Second is, if you owe taxes and you never filed that tax return, you can't rescue the file. I could make an argument that, hey, I forgot and I'm now up to date on my taxes and I've filed the taxes, but then it's at the discretion of the government to approve you or not.
What about issues where it's not related to the investor and it's really related to the project? What are some of those problems that you see?
Yeah, off late, especially off late, we've seen a lot of COVID projects that were launched during COVID that collapsed. And we have seen intense RFEs on the project side. And the RFEs want to know a couple of things. One, they want to know, have you been in compliance with the business plan? Have you materially deterred from the business plan? If you have, explained to us the facts and circumstances surrounding it. And a lot of the times the client will say, well, COVID hit, but we're way past COVID now, right? If you haven't made substantial progress towards actually making that entity ongoing and operating, you're going to have trouble. Second thing I've seen is failed financing. So when the file was first filed in, say, 2019 or 2020, the project said, hey, we will acquire the financing eventually. You know, most of those financing deals failed, or the project never got financing, or the project said, we're going to do 100 EB5 investors, and they got 10, and they didn't have the full capital stack. Fail, right? You don't have the full capital stack to complete the project. Can't overcome that unless you show the government that you found the money magically and are going to finish the project. And the third thing I've seen is going concern issues. So the government has the EIN number of the entity you formed. They tend to run that EIN to check if you've filed payroll records, if you've started employment creation. If they see nothing's going on with that entity, they're going to send you questions about the going concern nature of the project. I worked on a project that used biofuels. That was going to manufacture biofuels. And what ended up happening is they promised a very, very high return to the investors. They said, hey, we're going to pay out 7 to 8%. You know, you're going to all do well. And people from India tend to trust other Indians. So people invested. That project never took off because they were going to use grease from restaurants to make biofuel. And in the 2 years, in the year and a half, there was no restaurant waste because of the lockdown. And so that project completely collapsed. And in that collapse, not only did people lose money, it never started, and the government wanted to know if it's a going concern. And as soon as we said, well, it's not a going concern, they did spend some money, they said, well, there's a material change in this entity, and we're going to deny the EB-5. There are times where it's just nothing's been built, and the government says, hey, I looked on Google Earth and I found nothing, you know. So there have been a lot of those cases where the project promised something and didn't deliver, or didn't acquire the right permits, or changed the location of the project, or couldn't get financing. We've seen a host of denials from 2019, 2020 projects because of COVID-related disruptions.
Got it. We'll chat a little bit later when we talk a little bit about projects, about things to look for and keep in mind from an immigration perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess let's pause here and I'll let you translate, and then we'll talk a little bit kind of high level summary, and then move on to the project stuff.